Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. At first, I didn't think much of it. John worked long hours, just like most men do, right? He'd come home late from meetings or late-night projects. He was always exhausted, but he would assure me that everything was fine, that this was just temporary. Our life together felt solid. Family dinners, laughter, and planning our future. But as time passed, the late nights turned into something I couldn't ignore. I started feeling like he was slipping away, not just physically, but emotionally. He didn't want to talk about it, and every time I asked, he brushed me off with a tired smile. But deep down, something inside me knew. I had a gut feeling. I could see the strain in his eyes when he walked through the door, and the excuses just weren't adding up anymore. Then, it started with the small changes. His scent, for one thing. It wasn't his usual cologne anymore. It had a musky, unfamiliar undertone. I tried not to jump to conclusions. After all, he was working long hours, maybe spending more time in the city than usual. But when I asked him about it, he shrugged it off. His mood, too, was different. He was distracted, irritable. I couldn't help but notice it, even when we were having dinner or watching TV. His eyes were distant, like he wasn't really present, and every time I reached out to him, he'd pull away. His answers were short, almost as though he was hiding something from me. But I still trusted him. At least, I thought I did. The next thing I noticed was his new circle of friends. These weren't the people I'd met before, the ones I was familiar with. No, these were different. They didn't look like they belonged in our neighborhood, or at any corporate dinner party, for that matter. They were rough, loud, always standing around his car smoking cigarettes or talking in hushed tones. I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable every time they came around. John would just laugh it off when I mentioned it, say that they were business partners, but I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. Something didn't feel right. I asked him once, "Are you sure these people are good for you?" His face tightened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something, fear, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He reassured me again that everything was fine, but I wasn't so sure. It was one of those quiet afternoons when everything changed. John had rushed out to a meeting, leaving his phone on the kitchen counter. My curiosity got the best of me. I know it was wrong, but I couldn't help myself. I picked up the phone, telling myself I just needed to make sure he hadn't missed any calls from his clients or work. But then I saw it. An unfamiliar name on a text message, just a letter, T. It wasn't a name I recognized, and the text was brief, but the tone was strange. The message read, "Is the stuff ready for pickup?" My heart sank as I stared at the screen. I knew it could mean anything, but in my gut, I felt that it meant something bad. Something deeper than I was willing to admit to myself. I tried to brush it off, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I started doubting everything. The late nights, the new friends, the weird messages, everything. I needed answers. So, one evening, while John was out, I decided to follow him. I told myself it was just to clear my head, but deep down, I knew I was looking for something. I had to know the truth. I followed him, driving in the shadows, keeping a safe distance. He didn't head to his usual office building, though. Instead, he turned into a dimly lit street and parked outside a dive bar I didn't recognize. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I parked a few blocks away, just watching. I saw him walk into the bar, but it wasn't just him. There was a man standing outside, a figure who looked more like a street thug than a businessman. Tattoos, a cold stare. It was clear he didn't belong in the places John usually frequented. My heart raced, and the feeling of dread washed over me. What was happening to my husband? I couldn't hold it in anymore. The next day, when John got home, I confronted him. I didn't care about his late hours or his work anymore. I needed to know the truth. "Where were you last night?" I asked, my voice shaking. He froze for a moment, and his eyes flickered to the floor. That was when I knew. He was hiding something. "It's nothing, babe. Just a late meeting." But this time, I wasn't buying it. "I followed you," I said softly, watching his reaction. His face turned pale, and I could see the panic rising in his eyes. That's when it all started spilling out. The truth. The lies. The addiction he'd been trying so hard to cover up. I couldn't believe it. My own husband, tangled up with a drug dealer, getting pulled into a world he couldn't escape. "I'm in too deep," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And that was the moment I realized everything I thought I knew about my life had been a lie. I couldn't process what he had just said. In too deep? What did that even mean? My mind raced as John tried to explain. He talked about how one of his old friends had introduced him to a business deal that started small. It was supposed to be just an investment opportunity, something simple, but it escalated. John said he got caught up in the rush, the excitement, the money, the power. It all blinded him. "It was just drugs, babe. Nothing crazy at first," he said, almost as if he was trying to minimize it. But I could see through the lies. The look in his eyes, the fear in his voice. It was clear. He was addicted. To the high, to the thrill, to whatever this dark world had promised him. And I was left standing there, holding onto the remnants of the man I thought I knew. I didn't want to believe him. I refused to accept that the man I married, the man I had shared my dreams with, was now entangled in a world of drugs, violence, and lies. I tried to reason with him, tell him that he didn't need to do this, but he wouldn't listen. Every time I spoke, he shut me out. He said he was trying to get clean, that he was working on it, but it didn't feel real. The more he promised, the deeper I saw him sink. And I started to wonder if it was too late for him, for us. Was this the end of the road? I had to make a choice. Could I help him? Or was I just enabling his destruction? He'd been lying to me for so long, I didn't know what was truth anymore. John's physical appearance started changing. He lost weight, his skin became pale and ashen, and there was a hollowness in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. He was no longer the man I'd fallen in love with. He was a shell, a stranger. I couldn't help but feel like I was losing him to something that had consumed him completely, and it was breaking me. He became agitated at the smallest things, snapping at me when I tried to get close, when I tried to help. I could see the addiction in his face, in the way he would fidget, the way his hands would shake. There were days when I didn't even recognize him anymore. And yet, he kept promising me things would get better. He'd say he was done with the drugs, that he was trying to quit, but his actions told a different story. Every promise was empty, and I started to feel like I was living with a stranger. I couldn't take it anymore. I started going through his things, his wallet, his phone, his emails. I had to know what was really going on, what he wasn't telling me. That's when I found it. His bank statements, the money transfers, hundreds of thousands of dollars going to a name I didn't recognize. Raul? Raul wasn't just a friend or a business partner. He was a drug dealer, a dangerous one. My heart sank as I read through the emails, the transactions, and the chilling details about their business. John wasn't just addicted to drugs. He was caught up in something far bigger than either of us. I couldn't believe it. How had I missed all the signs? How had I ignored everything for so long? But I knew one thing for sure. My husband wasn't just working late anymore. He was living a double life. The truth was worse than I had imagined. When I confronted him again, he didn't even try to lie anymore. He just broke down. He told me everything. The drug deals, the late-night pickups, the money he owed Raul, and the fear that had been eating him alive. He wasn't just addicted to the drugs. He was in debt, and the people he owed weren't the kind of people you could walk away from. I could see the terror in his eyes, the shame, but none of that changed the reality of the situation. We were in danger, and our family was too. The lies had spiraled so far that I didn't know how to pull us out of it. I wanted to help him, I really did, but I couldn't help someone who wasn't willing to help themselves. And that's when the gravity of the situation really hit me. This wasn't just about John anymore. It was about our safety, our future, everything I had worked for. And I realized I had to make the hardest decision of my life. As John continued to unravel, more secrets came to light. He told me about his first encounter with Raul, how he had been introduced to the world of drugs as a way out of his financial struggles. But what started as a small business investment soon turned into a nightmare. I couldn't wrap my head around it. This man, this stranger I was living with, had been lying to me for months, keeping secrets so dark that I couldn't even comprehend them. But the worst part? He had kept these secrets from me, the woman who trusted him with everything. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers for every lie, every moment he had stolen from us. But all I could do was stand there, listening to him confess his sins while my world slowly crumbled around me. I didn't know who he was anymore. I thought it was over. But then, John swore he could fix everything. He promised he would go to rehab, that he would break free from Raul's grip. And for a brief moment, I believed him. I took him to the rehab center, hoping that he could find the strength to change, to come back to me. But nothing ever happened the way I wanted it to. The first few days seemed promising. He seemed more determined, more focused. But then he fell off again. The cravings came back. He started sneaking away, telling me he was working on it. But the truth was, he was sinking deeper into the world of addiction and lies. He promised me he was done, but every time he relapsed, it felt like a betrayal. I couldn't keep putting my life on hold, waiting for him to come back from a place I couldn't reach. I was desperate for him to change, but I couldn't help him if he didn't want to help himself. Everything came crashing down one night. I got a call, an anonymous tip about John. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened. The voice on the other end said, "Your husband owes Raul. He's in deeper than you think." I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew it was true. I rushed home, hoping it wasn't too late, hoping that somehow this could be fixed. But when I got there, John was gone. There was no note, no explanation, just an empty house, a cold silence, and the overwhelming realization that he was in trouble. He had disappeared into the shadows, running from the mess he had created. And I couldn't help him anymore. I felt abandoned, alone. I didn't know where he was or what was going to happen, but I knew that the person I loved was gone, and in his place was a man I no longer recognized. The days that followed were a blur of worry and fear. I didn't hear from John. His phone was disconnected. His friends, those dangerous, rough people he had surrounded himself with, weren't answering either. It wasn't until a week later that I got a call from a private number. It was Raul. His voice was cold, menacing. "You need to stop looking for him," he said, the words dripping with malice. "He's made his choices. You're better off letting it go." My heart sank. I could feel the danger in his voice, the threat that hung over me. I tried to argue, to plead for John's safety, but Raul didn't care. He warned me to stay out of it, for my own good. It hit me like a punch to the gut. John was gone, but the consequences of his choices were now going to haunt me. And the more I resisted, the more I realized that the world John had gotten himself into wasn't going to let either of us go easily. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I couldn't let him slip away into the darkness. Despite Raul's threats, I decided to find John, no matter the cost. I reached out to anyone who might know something, his friends, his coworkers, anyone who might have seen him, but every lead came to a dead end. It was like he had vanished without a trace. Desperation set in as I followed a trail of rumors, stumbling through dangerous parts of the city, trying to track down any sign of him. Each corner I turned felt darker and more dangerous. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop. I had to find him. I had to bring him back, even if I had no idea how deep in danger I was going. Just when I was starting to lose hope, my phone rang. I recognized the number. It was John's. My heart leapt in my chest. I answered it immediately, desperate to hear his voice, but the person on the other end wasn't John. It was Raul again. "He's here," Raul said, his voice rough and taunting. "But don't bother. He's too far gone." My world stopped. "What are you doing to him?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Let him go. You've already taken everything from me. Leave him alone." Raul chuckled darkly. "It's too late for that. You can't save him." The line went dead. I sank to my knees, tears filling my eyes. I couldn't reach him. I couldn't save him. And that truth, that brutal reality, shattered something inside me. I knew that the only way to get John back was to play by their rules. But what were their rules? I had no idea how deep the deal had gone, or what I was walking into. Desperation had driven me to the edge, and now I was ready to do anything to get him back. I knew I had to make a choice. If I wanted to save John, I had to enter this dangerous world, this nightmare he had created. I reached out to Raul, hoping that somehow, someway, I could make a deal. It wasn't about saving myself anymore. It was about getting John back. I was ready to risk everything. "Tell me what you want," I said when Raoul finally agreed to meet me. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I was prepared to face whatever came my way. The meeting was set for midnight in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. I felt my nerves unraveling as I drove there. The city felt different now, like I was stepping into a world that had no place for people like me. When I arrived, Raoul's men were waiting, their eyes cold and unreadable. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Raoul emerged from the shadows, his smile wicked, his eyes gleaming with something dark. He didn't make small talk. "You're here to make a deal," he said flatly. "But you should know, deals like this come with a price. There's no going back once you're in." My hands shook as I nodded. What choice did I have? "I just want my husband back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Raoul studied me for a long moment before he finally spoke. "It's simple. We let him go, but you take his place." I froze, not understanding what he meant. "What do you mean, take his place?" I asked, barely able to process his words. Raoul's smile widened as he explained. "It's the price you pay for getting involved in our business. You want him back? You're going to have to step into his shoes." I realized in that moment just how far gone John had truly become, and the price I would have to pay to bring him home. As the days passed, I thought I could outsmart Raoul, find a way to navigate this dangerous world without losing myself. But I was wrong. I was in deeper than I ever imagined. I had agreed to Raoul's terms because I didn't see another option. I didn't see that it would lead me down a path of no return. I became immersed in a world of violence, betrayal, and addiction. John's addiction had taken over our lives, but now, my own involvement in this underworld was pulling me further away from everything I had known. I found myself doing things I never thought I would, things that made me question who I was and what I had become. Each decision, each step into the darkness, chipped away at the person I used to be. And as much as I wanted to turn back, there was no going back now. The deeper I got into this world, the more dangerous it became. Raoul's operation was vast, far bigger than I had ever realized. Every step I took felt like I was walking on a tightrope. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. My days were filled with clandestine meetings, shady exchanges, and constant fear of being caught in something I couldn't escape. I had never imagined that my life would come to this, that I would be a part of a world I didn't understand. But I didn't have a choice. Every time I saw John, his face gaunt, his body trembling, it reminded me why I was doing this. I had to save him, even if it meant losing myself in the process. I started doing things I never thought I would. Carrying packages for Raoul, delivering messages, doing the dirty work that John used to handle. The weight of it all was suffocating, and I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. But it wasn't just the physical dangers that worried me. It was the toll it was taking on my soul. One night, I received a call. John was back. My heart raced as I heard his voice on the other end, shaky and weak. He said he wanted to leave, that he couldn't handle it anymore. "I'm done, babe. I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice barely audible. I felt a surge of hope, but it was fleeting. I knew it wouldn't be that easy. Raoul wasn't just going to let him walk away after everything he'd done for them. But I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that my husband, the man I loved, could be free from this nightmare. We arranged to meet, a place far away from the shadows of Raoul's world, but I knew we couldn't outrun the danger. John showed up, looking like a stranger, his eyes hollow and desperate. He looked at me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a flicker of the man I had once known, but it was fleeting. The weight of his addiction, the grip of Raoul's world, had changed him in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. "We need to leave now," I urged, desperate to escape with him. But as we started to walk away, we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. The people John owed weren't going to let him go that easily. Suddenly, everything turned chaotic. We ran, John and I, hand in hand, but we were out of time. The men who had been watching us closed in, their faces twisted with malice. It was like something out of a nightmare. I heard footsteps pounding behind us, but I couldn't look back. If I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to keep running. We pushed through the alleyways, through the maze of streets, but the fear in my chest was suffocating. I knew we had to get away. We had no choice. But then, a figure emerged in front of us, Raoul. His smile was cold, calculated. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he asked, his voice chilling. I stood frozen, terrified, as I realized the full extent of what I had gotten myself into. John pulled me closer, but it was too late. The deal had been made, and there was no going back. The chase led us to a dead end, a warehouse surrounded by the men who worked for Raoul. We were trapped. It felt like everything I had worked for, everything I had hoped for, was crashing down. I held on to John, trying to keep him calm, but the fear was palpable. Raoul's men closed in, their faces blank, emotionless. I turned to John, desperate. "We can't let them take you again. We can't go back to that life." But John was broken, and I could see it in his eyes. The drugs, the lies, the fear. It had all consumed him. "I can't get out," he whispered. "I'm sorry." It was then that I realized I couldn't save him. Not like this. The man I loved was gone, replaced by someone too far gone to recognize. And I had to face the reality that our lives had been shattered by a world we never belonged to. The moment I thought I'd lost everything, something changed. One of Raoul's men stepped forward. It was the last person I ever expected, someone who had been working with us all along, someone I thought was on our side. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold. And then, the betrayal hit me like a slap in the face. This person, this man I had trusted, had been playing both sides. He had been feeding information to Raoul the entire time, making sure I stayed trapped in this dangerous world. I couldn't believe it. The person I had hoped would help us escape was the one who had sold us out. It was all a game to him, and we were pawns. "You think you can escape?" he sneered. "This is your life now." And in that moment, I realized how deep I had fallen into this world. There was no getting out. We were bound, trapped in the warehouse, and all hope seemed lost. But then, out of nowhere, a chance. I don't know what made me do it. I think it was desperation, pure survival instinct, but I fought back. I didn't care anymore. I had nothing left to lose. I fought against the ropes that bound me, slipping free in a moment of chaos. John was still dazed, but I pulled him up, urging him to run. "We're not done yet," I whispered through gritted teeth. Together, we ran for the exit, knowing that Raoul's men were hot on our trail. We didn't have much time. I had no plan, no backup, just a burning need to get away. And somehow, by some miracle, we managed to slip through the shadows, escaping into the night. But I knew it wouldn't last. Not forever. Raoul would be looking for us, and there would be no hiding from the life we had left behind. As we ran, as we escaped into the unknown, I had to make a choice. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep looking over my shoulder, terrified of what might happen next. John was falling apart, and I was too. We were both caught in a web of lies, addiction, and danger that I couldn't see a way out of. And so, standing in the quiet of the night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I had to let him go. I couldn't save him. I couldn't keep chasing a man who had already lost himself. I couldn't keep running from the life I had built, the family I had once dreamed of. John wasn't the man I married anymore, and I had to let him go for my own sanity, my own safety. But the pain of it, letting go of the love of my life, was something I would carry with me forever. It wasn't easy to walk away. The pain of leaving John behind, of cutting ties with the man I had once loved so deeply, was something that gnawed at me every day. But I knew it was the only way forward. One night, I found myself at the place where it all began, our old home. I stood outside, staring at the empty windows. It was so quiet now. I hadn't expected to feel anything anymore, but the memories came flooding back. The laughter, the love, the life we had built. It all felt so far away now. The man who had once held me in his arms was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone lost in the darkness of his own choices. I left the house that night, not knowing what would become of him. I didn't know if I would ever see him again. But as I walked away, I realized that sometimes love isn't enough to save someone. Sometimes you have to let them go. Life went on, even though it didn't feel like it ever would. I moved away from the place that had once been home, trying to rebuild, to find a sense of peace. But the scars, they stayed. I had learned a painful lesson. Addiction doesn't just take the person who suffers from it. It takes everyone who loves them. I never heard from John again. The silence was deafening. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, if he was still tangled in that dangerous world, or if he had found a way out. I tried not to think about it, but the questions lingered. Would he ever find his way back to me? Would he ever escape the grip of the addiction that had consumed him? I couldn't answer those questions. All I knew was that I had to keep going. I had to survive, for myself and for the family we once dreamed of. But there would always be a part of me that wondered, what if? In the years that followed, I found a new sense of purpose. I focused on my career, on building a life that was mine again. Slowly, the weight of the past began to lift, and though the pain would always be there, it became something I could carry. I learned to forgive myself, to understand that I had done everything I could to help John. But in the end, I couldn't fix him. He had to want to change, and no matter how much I loved him, I couldn't do that for him. I met new people, made new connections, and for the first time in a long time, I started to feel like myself again. But I'll never forget what I went through, what I lost, and what I learned. Life doesn't always go the way you expect it to. Sometimes, it takes you down roads you never imagined, and you find yourself in places you never thought you'd be. But through it all, you have to keep going. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find the strength to move on.